So a lot of people are actually debating whether the best limit-free staple is. There is, of course, Compulse that is recently in a main box, and the two selection box exclusive traps, Crackdown and IDP. And a lot of people actually think that IDP is the best one, which is reasonable in a meta with Orcus running around. But all three staple traps are really good, and as a person who owns 3 copies of Crackdown, 4 copies of IDP, and 6 copies of Compulse, I want to give my own opinion on what I think is the most ideal trap to play in your deck. I also want to mention Warning Point. I have 5 copies of this card for some reason, and even though it's not limit free, it's still arguably better, if not as good as the other limit-free staple traps, because it both stops opponent from extending by preventing them to use that monster as extra deck material, and also it negates the effects, which none of the limit-free staples do. Crackdown actually doesn't negate the monster's effect, it only prevents them from activating it, so if they activate a monster effect and you chain Crackdown, you can't actually negate the monster effect. So, I still really recommend Warning Point for a lot of situations, even though it's not limit-free. That doesn't mean it's not as good as the other limit-free staples. In fact, it negates monster effects, which none of the other staple traps do. So, technically, Floodgate is also a limit-free trap for some reason. It's arguably worse than Warning Point in every single way. And Warning Point isn't even limited to free, and it's in a much better box than Floodgate, so there really isn't a reason to play Floodgate in the current metagame anymore, especially because it doesn't really work against Link monsters, so we're just not going to talk about this card. Okay, so let's talk about the limit-free traps one by one. First off, we have Compulse. This is the oldest one. It has a really simple effect. You can just target a monster on the field and return that monster back to the hand. You can return your own monsters or your opponent's monsters, and that makes it really, really versatile. It doesn't destroy, which is really good. It gets around floating effects and also protection effects like Dengirsu. And also, if you bounce an opponent's extra deck monster, it goes back to the extra deck, so your opponent can't just normal summon it during their next turn. And even if you're using it on a main deck monster, it oftentimes stops their entire combo if they are only relying on their normal summon. For example, if your opponent normal summons a Phantom Knight monster, and then you can just activate Compulse and bounce back that monster. So even though your opponent can normal summon that monster during their next turn, it does completely stop their combo, because they can't actually special summon their Silent Boots if they have no monsters on the field. So it works pretty well with that. And also it prevents your opponent from interacting with your own monsters. So say you activate a monster effect, and then your opponent chains, let's say, Warning Point, which negates your monster effects. So if you really, really want that monster effect to resolve, you can activate Compulse, bounce back your own monster, so your opponent's Warning Point will just not have a target on field. So your effect will still resolve. It also gets rid of your own monsters if they're, for example, Bloodgated, or for some reason if your opponent has a Phoenix Chain that negates your monster's effects, and your own monsters are clogging your own field, you can just bounce them back, so you can just summon them in next turn. Next up is Crackdown. You can activate by targeting a face-up monster your opponent controls, and just grab that monster, it's yours now. While you control that monster, it cannot attack or activate effects, and when that monster leaves the field, you destroy this card. So again, I've mentioned that this doesn't actually negate the monster's effects, it prevents it from activating effects. So if you chain it from your opponent activating a monster effect, their effect will still resolve, so it is not a monster negate, but it is a really good removal. It's probably the best form of removal, in that you're not only getting rid of your opponent's monsters, you're also taking it for yourself. So if your opponent has a monster that has some kind of effect when it goes to the graveyard or when banished, it doesn't activate because you take it for yourself. And also you get a free monster, which is really good for both defending yourself from attacks and also using them as an extra deck material. For example, using it for a Nightmare Unicorn or Nightmare Phoenix. And also, similarly to Compulse, both effects are not once per turn. So if you have multiple copies of Compulse and multiple copies of Crackdown, you can activate all of them during the same turn. And Crackdown, in terms of a defensive ability, is probably the best of the three, because you're getting rid of both one of your opponent's monster and also getting a free monster for yourself to block your opponent's attacks. But it does have a huge downside in that your opponent can just pop it and they get back their monster like it's nothing. So usually that is not a problem, because if they have MST or Cosmic, they will activate it before they even do their combo anyway. But if they have a back removal during their combo, like from one of their monsters that they are going to make, they will be able to pop this card and just grab back their monster like it's nothing. Which is the main weakness of this card. And also, this card does clog your back row, because it is a continuous trap. So as long as that monster is on your field, it does clog one of your back row spaces, which usually is not that big of a deal, but for some decks, especially pendulum decks that really care about the amount of zones they have, it might be a slight problem. And also, if you use that monster as an Xyz material, it stays on the field, it doesn't go to the graveyard, the trap, so it will clog your field forever. And finally, it is IDP. Most people, I believe, think that this card is the best of the three, and because it banishes without targeting and also gets rid of one of your cards in your opponent's graveyard. So what this card does is you can special summon one monster from your opponent's graveyard and negate its effects, and then you have an option to banish one monster from both players' fields that have the same type as each other. So, for example, if your opponent summons Scrap Recycler and they send Harp Horror to the graveyard, both monsters are machines, so it is the perfect scenario to activate IDP. So you activate IDP, you summon their Harp Horror from their graveyard to your field, and then you can banish both your Harp Horror that you stole and your opponent's Scrap Recycler, which are both machines. So you not only get rid of your opponent's Scrap Recycler, you also get rid of your opponent's Harp Horror from their graveyard. So that's actually two banishes that this card can potentially do. And even if your opponent doesn't have a matching type in their field, you still get rid of one monster from your opponent's graveyard, which is also pretty good. But this card has a hard once per turn, so if you have multiple copies of this card on your field, you can only activate one of them per turn, which does come up sometimes. I have situations where I draw multiple copies of IDP and I can only activate one of them, which against some decks is just not enough. And also, even though this effect is really good, it banishes without targeting, it only works against specific decks, and it only works when your opponent has a monster in the graveyard. So, for example, your opponent is playing Phantom Knights. They use their graveyard effects a lot, right? IDP is really good against Phantom Knights because all of their monsters are warrior monsters, and they have a bunch of graveyard effects. So it is a really good card against Phantom Knights, but you can't use it to respond to their normal summon. So, for example, for cards like Crackdown or Compulse, when they normal summon, let's say, a Ragged Gloves, you can just immediately activate a trap, steal it, or bounce it back to the hand, and if they don't have any sort of follow-up, and usually they don't because Silent Boots requires you to have a Phantom Knight on your field to actually special summon itself, they will just be forced to end turn, unless they have exactly Stained Greaves in their graveyard, which is very unlikely, actually. That does not happen very often. So, in the case of that, it is a lot better to use Compulse or Crackdown, but IDP, you will have to kind of wait for your opponent to summon their monsters and make their Xyz detach one, and that is when you activate IDP. So by this time, your opponent already has 2 Phantom Knights on the field that they already used to make an exceed. So even if you banish one Phantom Knight that they detached and also the exceeds, they still have the second one that gets to the graveyard. So it is a bit less ideal in that situation because you have to wait for your opponent to actually have a monster in their graveyard to banish. And also, it's just bad against some decks. Some decks don't have monsters in the graveyard, like Pendulum decks. They all go back to the extra deck, so this card is basically useless against GDs, Sulfur Chords, or even like Odd Eyes, but not a lot of people are actually playing Odd Eyes, but yeah, you get my point. And also, it's bad against decks that don't play a specific type. Like Synchrons, back when that deck was all over the place, they end on a single Croc. And Croc is fish, and they don't play any other fish monsters in their entire deck. So that's another problem. So if your opponent goes first and they end on the Croc, you can't really get rid of it using IDP because they don't play any other fish monsters. So there is that problem as well. So overall, all cards have their pros and cons. Which one is the best? I think all 3 of them are really good, obviously. That's the entire reason why they're limited to 3. Personally, my favorite is always Compulse. Compulse is just very generic. It works against every single deck. It's versatile. You can bounce your own monsters, you can bounce your opponent's monsters, you can activate it whenever you want, and it's just good overall. It's also the easiest to obtain with the free staple traps like Crackdown and IDP. Both cards are from a selection box, so you will have to likely spend money to get them if you want a playset of them. Crackdown is probably a lot cheaper than a lot of the other staples if you're willing to spend a bit of money because it's from a super mini selection box, so it is quite cheap, but you can get Compulse for absolutely free. It's from a new main box that it is just added. So it is a good option for new players to invest. So in terms of like cost, it is the best one, and also in terms of effect, I also think that because you don't really know what your opponent is playing, it's just the best to play a trap that is good against any deck. Even though it's not ideal against certain decks, like for example if you're playing against Orcust, of course the ideal trap is always going to be IDP because you banish their Hopper, but activating Compulse against their Galtea is also pretty good. It's not the best, they still get to, send cards to the graveyard, but it's still good, it's still not bad. And also, Compulse is able to counter decks that IDP absolutely couldn't. So I think most of the time I prefer Compulse. For example, in this hero deck that I built, I use 3 copies of Compulse. So and it has the added bonus of if you play multiple copies, you don't have to worry about the hard ones per turn because you can just activate multiple Compulse in a single turn and not worry about hard ones per turns because it doesn't have one. And the second best of the 3 is probably going to be IDP, obviously, because it's a really good card. It's good against this meta, where every deck is playing graveyard effects. Crackdown is also really good, but IDP is just better in this meta, specifically because of the amount of Orcust decks running around, and also other decks that use graveyard effects like Phantom Knights and stuff like that. So in this meta, I would prefer IDP more than Crackdown, but Crackdown is still a really good card to get. It will be good depending on the meta, and yeah. And if you're gonna spend money to get one of the free limit free stable traps, I'll probably get Crackdown if you're willing to spend the money, because it is the cheapest in terms of like actual money you spend because it's from a super mini selection box. It's going to be cheaper than getting Compulse from a main box, but if you're a free-to-play player, you don't really have a choice. You have to get Compulse. And yeah, I just really like combos. It's just so versatile, which I just really like over the other traps. But also, again, I want to mention Warning Point is also a really good trap, so it's not only the limit free traps that are good. You can always just play Warning Point, and this card negates monster effects, which none of the other traps do. So yeah, that is my thoughts of the limit free traps. Feel free to tell me what you think in the comments. Again, all 3 limit traps are good, so there really is a reason to play any one of them. And also I want to mention, some people like to play like a combination of these cards. Maybe like 1 Compulse and 2 IDP, or like 1 of each limit free trap. I don't really like that. Because there is a scenario that you draw the wrong trap in the wrong time, and I'd rather have 1 trap that is just universally good against most decks than to have to, you know, draw the right trap in the right situation. And there is clearly a if there is clearly a preference in which trap I like more, there really isn't a reason to only play 1 copy of that trap and stuff in other limit free traps like IDP or Crackdown. There is a argument if you prefer IDP to only play maybe 1 or 2 IDPs and other limit free traps just because of its hard once per turn. But yeah, for my personal preference, I just like playing 3 copies of a single trap, but that's just my preference. Of course, you can always play a combination of them if you don't have 3 copies of these cards. Of course, I spend a lot of money in this game, that's why I have 6 copies of Compulse and 4 copies of IDP, but not every single player has that many copies of these traps, so it is completely understandable if you don't play 3 copies of them, and it's completely fine. It's just my personal preference. So yeah, let me know what you think. Which trap is the best? And do you like playing 3 copies of each? Or do you like to play a combination of those cards? Anyway, thanks for watching, goodbye.